Ready.
Okay, we're going to get started now. Thank you all very much for joining us. We're going to talk for about an hour on the subject of Christian Zionism and Islamophobia, and we'd like to leave about an hour for questions. So if you can hold on that long, we want to get as much feedback and input from you in the audience as we can on this. Christian Zionism is not a subject that normally comes up a lot in Washington. The four of us are convinced that it's a subject that should be coming up a lot in Washington. It's something that we should be talking about more. I'm Phil Giraldi, for those of you who don't know me. I'm Executive Director of the Council for the National Interest, former CIA officer who's seen the light, and I'll be the first speaker. Christian Zionism and Islamophobia, as I said, is a subject that doesn't get discussed very much in Washington. In the United States, many believe that there should be a strict separation between religion and government. In practice, that separation has never really existed, with Christianity shaping government policy in many important areas since the founding of the Republic. In the 19th century, in a number of states, a nominally secular government existed side by side with collection of a special tithe tax to support the dominant Christian denomination. I will defer to my colleagues for a more serious and focused discussion of Christian Zionism, but I would like to make a few points about its political significance. Christian Zionism, by definition, consists of Christians, normally Protestant evangelicals, who believe that the book of Revelations predicts that certain steps must be taken to bring about the second coming of Jesus Christ, at which point the believers themselves will be raptured up to heaven. Many Christian Zionists believe that the second coming will happen soon, and because the return of the Jews to the Holy Land is a precondition of that, they support the government and people of Israel completely and unconditionally in all that they do, to include the expansion by force into historic Judea, which would include what remains of the Palestinian West Bank. Another aspect of Christian Zionism is the belief that the end time, as they refer to it, will be preceded by an enormous battle pitting the forces of good against the forces of evil, in which all the evildoers will be destroyed and the righteous will be triumphant. The battle is supposed to take place at Armageddon, an undisclosed location in the Middle East that some believe is derived from the name of the ancient Hittite capital Megiddo. That Christian Zionists believe the return of Christ is imminent and that there will be a major war in the Middle East preceding it would appear to be irrelevant to most of us. But it has in this case, real-world consequences because of the involvement of Christian Zionists in American domestic politics and their influence over some aspects of U.S. foreign policy. Evangelical Christians began to mobilize and became a potent political force in the 1980s. Many of the issues they supported were social, such as being anti-abortion and hostile to homosexual rights, but there was also from the start an identification with Israel and a sense that Israel had to be protected above and beyond the normal American foreign policy interests in the Middle East region. Through the creation of organizations like 2 million strong Christians United for Israel, or CUFI, headed by Pastor John Hagee, this focus on Israel obtained a mechanism for uniting evangelicals and providing them with a means and direction to lobby Congress to continue high levels of aid for Israel and also to resist any attempts to diminish support for Israeli policies. This mechanism was most recently seen in action on Monday of this week when 200 CUFI leaders were flown to Washington, all expenses paid, to lobby their senators against confirmation of Chuck Hagel as Secretary of Defense. I would suspect that if they had 200 people, they probably had 4 from each state, so they could lobby every single senator. Hagel has been criticized by the Christian Zionists as being less than completely supportive of Israel and hesitant to go to war with Iran on behalf of Israel. The focus on Israel, coming from possibly as many as 30 million evangelicals concentrated in a number of southern and border states, the Bible Belt, has meant that few congressmen from those states feel it to be in their interest to question what Israel does. In fact, they find it in their interest to do the contrary and frequently express loud and long their love of Israel, which may or may not be genuine. This provides a political free pass to the Israeli settlements and also to Israel's aggressive foreign policy vis-a-vis its neighbors, which has damaged other American interests in the region. It also means that any consideration of Arabs as aggrieved parties in the Middle East fandango is seldom expressed, even though many of the Arabs being victimized by the policies of Israel are in fact Christian. John Hagee has stated falsely that the Quran calls on all Muslims to kill all Christians and Jews. The persistent identification of Muslims as extremists, as enemies of Israel, and also as supporters of terrorism by evangelicals in general and Christian Zionists in particular, has led to a quite natural growth of Islamophobia in the United States. This prejudice arises from the perception that Islam is integral to the problems with the Arab world, leading to an unfortunate surge in those Americans who believe that Islam is an evil religion and that Muslims should be monitored by the authorities and even denied some basic civil rights or deported because they cannot be trusted. Because the Armageddonists believe that there will be a final confrontation with the forces of evil, it has been necessary to identify an enemy, and the enemy is all too often characterized as all Muslims. Hagee has construed this conflict as ongoing resistance to satanic proxies opposing the end time, and has already called on the United States and Israel together to attack Iran as part of that struggle. Israel itself has been quick to recognize the advantages to be derived from close and continuing relationship with the Christian Zionists, even though Israel's leaders almost certainly find the return of Christian theology, the end-time Christian theology, invidious, as all Jews but those who convert to Christianity will also die and go to hell when the world ends. When groups like Kufi organize their mass pilgrimages to visit Israel, they spend all their time in Israel, frequently refusing to visit major Christian holy sites in Arab areas or meet Palestinian Christians. When they gather in Jerusalem, they are often feted by Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who frequently speaks to them. Evangelical leaders, to include Pat Robertson and John Hagee, have also benefited more directly in other ways. The Israeli government has presented both Robertson and Hagee with Gulfstar executive jets to make their evangelizing more comfortable. It has, of course, been suggested that American aid and charitable contributions to Israel are thus being recycled to support those groups that are inevitably willing to provide still more aid until the well runs dry in Washington, which may happen soon. So the bottom line for me is that the Christian Zionist involvement in American politics on behalf of the U.S. relationship with Israel does not serve any conceivable national interests unless one assumes that Israel and the United States are essentially the same, which is unsustainable. On the contrary, the Christian Zionist politicizing has been a major element in supporting the generally obtuse U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East region and elsewhere in the Muslim world. It serves a particularly narrowly construed parochial interest that, ironically, is intended to bring about the end of the world, possibly a victory for gentlemen like Pastor John Hagee if his interpretation of the Bible is correct, but quite likely a disaster for the rest of us. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd like to introduce John Utley as our next speaker. John has been a friend of mine for many years. He's associate publisher of the American Conservative magazine. He's an advisor to antiwar.com website. He's written extensively on the issue of Christian Zionism. He was one of the first conservatives that I know of who began to address the issue of the Armageddonists and what their political agenda was.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you all for coming. It's a subject, as Phil says, not very much mentioned in the U.S., especially the irrational aspects in big media. I was at a heritage event some years ago, and they asked the editors of major newspapers in the United States, how is the 21st century evolving different to what your people imagined? And they all said, none of us ever imagined the return to religious fundamentalism of the great religions, the great Western religions. What happened and what is happening. I've been following, of course, we all know the Muslim fanaticism, etc., is reported all the time in the American media, but also in Israel and in the United States, we have fanatics that are pretty close or on the same wavelength. If you will, the fundamentalists is not an exact term, not all, but these people all feed off each other. They each tell they each quote what the most extreme members of the others say, and the three great religions have a constant, continuing dialogue among the extremists on both sides. I've been, although this is about evangelicals, I've been to J Street, the Jewish group that is against AIPAC and supports a just two-state solution in the Middle East. And if you put my name, J Street Utley, you'll come to my articles. But one of the things that amazed me was members of the Knesset speaking at their meeting about the ultra-Orthodox religious people, the Haradim, in Israel, and how they had 20 bills they'd put in against free speech, independent judiciary, democratic institutions. They're pushing segregated buses in Israel, segregated sidewalks to keep women separate. It's equivalent to the extreme Muslim, of course not as violent, but that's changing apparently in Israel. The last election, for the first time, the new Yesh Atid party got 20 votes against 19 for the religious parties that have had tremendous control almost of the government. The new party wants to force the schools. 27% of Israeli children in yeshiva schools with no math, no science, no history. And this party wants to change the law to force the schools that are subsidized to teach those kind of subjects. Anyway, we're about evangelicals in America. It's a big part of the Republican base. I notice Oklahoma, Phil spoke about Hagel, both senators in Oklahoma against Hagel, which is a big evangelical state. It also is the place where most bombs are manufactured. So you get 2 for 1, good business. The key arguments to attack Iran is often they're irrational. They're crazy. They want to go to heaven. With one bomb, they'll drop it on Israel and all get killed, but that's what they're looking for. Well, we have people who are as enthusiastic as that accusation. Tom DeLay spoke at the Christians United for Israel, Hagee's conference. A young Jewish journalist, Blumenthal, went with a video and interviewed Tom DeLay, who thought he was speaking to a like-minded. And Tom DeLay says on the video, I live for the end times. He was 3 beats from the presidency. I live for the end times. I hope they come tomorrow. That can be found if you search DeLay Christians United for Israel video. So the video comes up, you'll find it. There's also an interview with the Israeli ambassador there who's asked about this. Well, what kind of alliance is this that they hope that Israel will bring about the end times, and Jews who don't convert will be killed by God? And the Israeli, do look at the video, you'll see his answer. Formerly, these evangelicals were not political. Reagan brought them into the political system. They were not because they thought the end times were coming sooner, any day. It's getting a little long in the tooth because Israel was founded 60, 70 years ago, and the second coming has not yet come, so there's some meant to come sooner. The evangelical, I might add, the main issues, abortion, family values, homosexuality, school prayer, basic conservative issues. Chris Hedges in the New York Times religion correspondent has written books on this. The bitterness of many blue-collar whites, males particularly, who have not achieved or are left behind in society. Whatever it is, they have an agenda which passes over in the political spectrum. The first evangelical I knew was Jimmy Carter, and he was a man of obviously very Christian principles, and a very sincere man, and I had a very high opinion of evangelical. But I would come from the anti-communist movement. In the anti-communist times, Reagan brought in the evangelicals, and that's why I met many, and I'm in meetings even today, heavily evangelical. There's a darker agenda, as Phil has explained, obsession with revelations, which I might add is a controversial issue. Martin Luther, the Revelations is so contrary to the rest of Christ in the Bible that Martin Luther did not translate it when he published the Protestant Bible. So it's not, but many well-meaning Christians believe it. It's not the extreme here that is taken over by the Christian Zionist. There's different levels, premillennial, first comes Armageddon, and then they go to heaven, or the good ones go to heaven first, and then comes Armageddon, different disputes. But I like the gospel music, and I listened to it, and I kept hearing all these happy people singing about going on a one-way trip. I thought going to New York or something. And then it dawned on me, of course, what it meant. And then you hear songs, a famous song, "I'll have the time of my life when the time of my life is over," and so on. So it's not, there's a great focus on that. They see the founding of Israel as helping, and if you go out west, you see movies. On the TV, you'll see trying to collect money to bring Russian Jews to Israel, because the part of the Second Coming involves most Jews, in some of the theories, have to be back in Israel. And then they also have to occupy the whole of ancient Judea. So that's where they want the settlements. They support the settlements on the West Bank, etc. The point is that obviously, the Second Coming is not good for the Jews. It's an expression. Pat Robertson, one of the points I also make is, they say often, they quote, "God helps or loves those who help the Jews, but it's only Jews who make war. Jews who make peace are not," according to their theories. I quote Pat Robertson, when Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, Pat Robertson said, well, he was getting in the way of God's will, as if God wants war. I mean, this kind of thinking, you see where it goes. Their very successful series of books, Left Behind, was also made into a movie. I saw the movie. It starts in an airplane where a woman says to the stewardess, "Please, my husband, I can't find him, he disappeared." And the stewardess said, "Well, I'll look in the restroom." And the woman says, "Well, take his clothes, they're on the seat." And so then a mother starts screaming for her child, and the child is gone. Well, the good people have been taken to heaven. This is the way the movie starts. The bad people, including the co-pilot, I might add, the pilot was having an affair with the stewardess, so was not taken, and they landed safely. In any case, these are the kind of stories, but there's a lot of revenge fantasy. Vanity Fair did an article on this, a revenge fantasy in which right-wing Christians win out over the rational, scientific, modern, post-Enlightenment world. Liberals, gays, abortion, all driving Christ out of the public square. I might add the evangelical reaction sort of came when the U.S. government got into the schools, taking away prayer, the abortion, and so on. Another point, how am I doing?
You have 4 minutes.
Okay. Another point is war. When I put my article out there, when Lieberman was the senator from Connecticut who lost the primary to a Democratic opponent, Lieberman is as far left as they go on pro-gay, pro-abortion, all the union issues, on all the social and economic. He's way out there. But the evangelicals then united to support him when he lost the primary, was running independent and won again. he got big evangelical support. It was more important, a man who was very supportive of the settlements on the West Bank, of war, etc., was more important than all the social values. It's that strong a feeling. I think the point of all this is that we have well-meaning people of all religions, if you will, three, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, well-meaning people. You now have an election in Israel where reaction against this. We have in America, we have to be focused on this issue and work together against these extremists that would really drive the world into chaos. And of course, not Armageddon, or perhaps, but hopefully many of us here, and this session is giving some publicity to these kind of issues that are not on the media in any big way here. Thank you very much.
Now our next speaker is going to be Norton Mezvinsky. Norton, like John, has been a friend of mine for a number of years. Norton is a professor of history emeritus at Connecticut State University. He's also the president of the International Council for Middle East Studies, and he's written a very well-known book on Jewish fundamentalism. It's called Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel, which he co-authored with Israel Shahak. Norton?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Historians are often concerned about definitions. Hence, I want to begin by adding a bit to the definition of Christian Zionism. In this discussion, we are dealing with evangelical Christian Zionism. Many other Christian churches, theologians, and individuals who have expressed agreement with and support of Zionism, the nationalist ideology that constitutes the heart center of the State of Israel's character, could also be considered Christian Zionists of different sorts. That is a topic for another day. Although a majority of evangelicals in the United States and some other places as well are Christian Zionists, a minority are not, and some, such as the renowned evangelical spokesperson Tony Campolo, actually are opposed to Christian Zionism. How many evangelical Christian Zionists are there in the United States? The estimates vary widely. Jerry Falwell, before he died a few years ago, said the number was 100 million. That was an exaggeration. In a recent op-ed piece in the New York Times, a commentator wrote that the number was 20 million. That is an underestimate. My research indicates that the number is at least 40 million and could be somewhat larger. Whereas a dispute may exist about the actual number, there should be no dispute about the fact that the evangelical Christian Zionists have established one of the most influential and efficient political lobbies in this country. The Christian Zionist lobby is at least as influential as the Israel lobby in maintaining and expanding American support for Zionism, the State of Israel, and Israeli policies regarding the Palestinian-Israeli, Arab-Israeli conflict. Christian Zionist groups and leaders lobby and pressure members of Congress, presidents of the United States, and administration officials with great success. Some Christian Zionists have become and are members of Congress and administration officials. They work diligently to keep the United States government solidly in support of the State of Israel. Public support in the United States for Christian Zionism has grown steadily during the past 4 decades. Indications of this are the enormous sales of popular novels espousing Christian Zionism. The late great Planet Earth, written by Hal Lindsey and Carol Carlson, published in 1970, was the first of these. Over 26 million of this one novel had been sold by 1990. The number has almost doubled since then. the Left Behind series of 16 novels written by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins, published between 1995 and 2007, has sold tens of millions of copies in English and has been translated, published, and sold in other languages. Video and movie spin-offs of these novels have been produced and are still being watched. Garnering support for Zionism, the State of Israel, and policies by Christian Zionists stems directly from the theology of Christian Zionism. Briefly stated, Christian Zionism is one type of Protestant fundamentalism. It stresses the literal interpretation of the Bible and emphasizes the necessity of acceptance of Jesus Christ as the Son of God and as a personal Savior. In addition to that, Christian Zionism is the modern-day advocacy of a particular theological system known as premillennial dispensationalism, which was initiated and developed in the early 19th century by the English clergyman John Nelson Darby and the Scottish clergyman Edward Irving. This advocacy blossomed in the United States. According to premillennial dispensationalism, world history is divided into certain periods or dispensations. As part of this construct, Jews must and will be either the sole occupants of or will be in full control of the Holy Land, which includes at least the entirety of today's state of Israel before the second coming of Jesus, which in turn will follow Armageddon, called the mother of all holocausts. During Armageddon, only the true believers will be raptured to safety above the earth, while all other people who will have followed the Antichrist, who precedes Jesus, will be killed. Some Christian Zionists say that only 144,000 Jews, that's out of about 15 million in this world, and according to the last census, about 5.7 in Israel, only 144,000 who will have correctly accepted Jesus as their Savior will be included among those raptured and saved. A few Christian Zionist leaders say that all Jews will be spared from death during Armageddon because they will immediately accept Jesus correctly when he returns to this world. Pastor John Hagee, perhaps the #1 Christian Zionist leader, changed his original position a while ago and now agrees that Jews will be spared during Armageddon. According to some commentators, he changed because of his close connections with Israel's political leaders, the many awards and favors he receives from these leaders, the fame in certain circles he has achieved, and the large sums of money he continually receives as payment for his advocacy. Much more can and should be said about all that I have mentioned, but in the remainder of my presentation, I shall focus upon Christian Zionism and its views of Islam and Muslims. From the Christian Zionist perspective, Islam is an evil religion. The Prophet Muhammad was actually, or is the equivalent to, an agent of Satan, if not Satan himself. Thus, Muslim believers in and followers of Islam are dangerous. In regard to this latter emphasis upon Muslims who are American citizens, there are some differences among Christian Zionists. Acknowledging that American Muslims are at least potentially dangerous because they believe in and follow Islam, some Christian Zionists say that these Muslims need to be watched closely and need to be confronted, stopped, and even arrested when they do suspicious things. Other Christian Zionists literally wish to deny all Muslims many rights and privileges granted to other citizens. With few, if any, exceptions, all Christian Zionists warn against the danger of Muslims attempting to invoke Sharia, Islamic religious law, in the United States. Christian Zionists do not differentiate, as do some people, between what is often referred to as militant, radical, and extremist Islam and what is termed by some as moderate Islam. For Christian Zionists, again, Islam itself, all of it, is evil. It allegedly preaches, according to these Christian Zionists, the killing of non-Muslims and the establishment of Islamic rule under Sharia law for the world. In their sermons, speeches, and writings, Christian Zionist pastors and other spokespeople clearly state that Islam is evil. They attempt to fortify their interpretations by specifying certain series or chapters of the Quran, using, of course, their own translations into English from the Arabic. Many examples of their writings, sermons, and speeches can be easily found on the internet. In citing series from the Quran, Christian Zionist leaders are often creative. They, for example, employ what they call abrogation, which they maintain means the removal of one verse or change of a verse with another newer verse to make something lawful in Islam, which was previously ruled unlawful. According to these Christian Zionist critics of the Quran, series or chapters, over 60% of the Quran contain abrogation. These Christian Zionist critics claim that the latter verses, which Muhammad allegedly received from Allah, supersede earlier verses. One illustrative example is that a surah saying that Jews and others will have a place in heaven, those surahs are superseded by a surah that only Islam will be accepted by Allah. Even more severe surahs, giving the impression that Islam is a kind and tolerant religion, are allegedly superseded and abrogated by later verses that call for waging war against all who do not believe in Islam. The Christian Zionist stated examples of abrogation are numerous. Since time limitations do not permit my citing, as I would like to do, many statements from Christian Zionist leaders that emphasize the evils of Islam and the danger from and damage already committed by Muslims, I shall present one representative example, the essence of which has been and is still repeated over and over again by Christian Zionist spokespeople. Michael Evans, who is a widely acclaimed Christian Zionist spokesperson, he is that. He is also a best-selling author and has appeared on the BBC and United States major television networks and has published articles in the Wall Street Journal and the Jerusalem Post. In his 2003 book, Beyond Iraq, The Next Move, he insists that Muslims were the modern-day representatives of the forces of Satan that must be crushed. He called Muhammad a proto-terrorist who banished and killed Jews for not believing in him. He claimed that terrorism is a logical sequence of Islam. He argued that the Gaddafis, Khomeinis, bin Ladens, and Husseins of the modern day are disciples of Muhammad and Islam. He called Islam a malevolent manifestation of religion conceived in the pit of hell, end quote. He equated Islam with the Antichrist, against whom all Christians must fight with all the resources at their command. Again, what Evans has asserted in his book and elsewhere constitutes the Christian Zionist overall view of Islam and Muslims. Okay. Although I did not need to be reassured that what Evans has written and said correctly represents the Christian Zionist position, I was so reassured 2 weeks ago when I attended a discussion led by an evangelical Christian pastor with whom I have somehow established a working relationship. I told him that I intended to quote Evans in my talk today. He told me that he was speaking for all Christian Zionist leaders he knew, and he said, Evans told the gospel truth. Although I knew it would not raise any question at all in his mind, I could not help but cite for him a Yiddish proverb from the many that my grandmother used to delight in telling us. And in a sense, that may be a good way for me to end my talk today. Here's the proverb. Der Emes lebt nicht, der Emes starb nicht, der Emes martyrt sich. The truth is not alive, the truth is not dead, it struggles. Thank you very much.
We're going to end now with Professor Fuad Shaban. He's the Vice President of Yarmouk Private University in Syria. He's the author of Islam and Arabs in Early American Thought and For Zion's Sake, the Judeo-Christian Tradition in American Culture. He's spoken at a number of American universities. What?
I would also begin with a quotation from Genesis, where God says, I have not sent these prophets, but they went. I have not spoken to them, but they prophesied. Am I correct?
Can you repeat that? I didn't hear it.
I have not sent these prophets, but they went. I have not spoken to them, but they prophesied.
Thank you.
Thank you. My colleagues, yes. My colleagues have provided a clear picture of Christian Zionism, the evolution of its theology and politics, and its current attitude to Islam and Muslims. To complete the picture, it remains to provide a brief account of the historical and cultural genesis. I'm sorry. Yeah. It remains to provide a brief account of the historical and cultural genesis of Christian Zionism and of the development of a few of its principal features in America. For I believe that some of the major features of Christian Zionism have existed in varying degrees throughout American history and have exercised a good deal of influence on America's religious as well as politics, on its relations with Arabs and Muslims. I should begin by clearly stating that what I will describe as features of Christian Zionism in the cultural historical context does not mean that early on in American history, these features can be described as full-fledged Christian Zionism in politics and theology as delineated by Dr. Mizvinsky. Rather, these are features that fed into what became, in the second half of the 19th century, Christian Zionism proper. Americans have always been occupied with eschatology and end-time predictions and millennialism. Millennialism has been on the mind of many generations of believers in the States. Boston University historian Richard Lands said in a PBS Frontline Roundtable in 2001 that, and I quote, from the perspective of the millenarian historian, America fell in the millennial vat at birth and has yet to get out of it. As a matter of fact, I have researched literally hundreds of end-time predictions made by Americans from the Puritan settlements to the present time. And a major characteristic of American millennialism is the belief that Providence has assigned a special role to America in the end-time scenarios. Because of the time limits, I will emphasize two constant characteristics which have been instrumental in its theology and politics, especially in its influence on America's attitude to Islam. These two characteristics are, number one, the end-time eschatological scenarios, which are based on conceived prophecies in the holy texts of Christianity. Number two, the place assigned to Islam in these scenarios, and the consequent attitudes and behavior towards Islam and Muslims by American Christian Zionists. It will be evident that these two features are interconnected by a reciprocal cause and effect relationship, and that they have increased in their dominance of some religious churches and denominations down the centuries. Although we speak of American Christian Zionism, American, we need to recognize that the seeds of this movement were part of American European heritage, that these seeds underwent a process of transmogrification into their patently American form. In the immediate and distant European background of both Christopher Columbus and the Puritan immigrants to the New World were memories of the Crusades, the Ottoman encroachments in the heart of Europe, and the recapture of Andalusia by Spanish and European forces by Ferdinand and Isabella. Furthermore, for the Puritan settlers, there was in the immediate background and in their actually past experience an added factor of their Protestant heritage, which has in it much more seeds of Christian Zionism. We need only mention the interpretations of biblical texts by Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Bibliander, and others to see the connection drawn between Muhammad, the Pope, and the Antichrist with the end of the world. I should hasten to add that this is not a reflection on most of the mainstream churches in America today. In fact, a large number of Methodist, Lutheran, Catholic, and even Baptist churches and groups are very active in projects of peaceful coexistence and dialogue and in the taking place in the Middle East. Eschatology and fear of Islam were both present, side by side, in all of these developments. When Christopher Columbus conceived of his enterprise of the Indies, he stated many times in his letters, journals, and in his unfinished book, the Book of Prophecies, modeled after the Holy Book of Prophecies, that his central goal was to defeat the empire of Muhammad and to recapture the Holy Land in preparation for the beginning of the millennial kingdom of Christ. In his letter to the Spanish monarchs requesting their patronage of his enterprise of the Indies, Columbus promised to recruit the newly converted peoples in the battle of life and death against the empire of Muhammad. And in one journal, he states clearly his belief, and I quote, "God made me the messenger of the new heaven and the new earth in which he spoke in the Apocalypse by St. John, after having spoken it through the mouth of Isaiah. And he showed me the spot where to find it." It is in his repeated references to the Promised Land and the war with Islam in the context of biblical prophecies that I consider Columbus to be the first to introduce elements of Christian Zionism to the New World. In the 19th century, America witnessed a surge of populist religious activities, mainly the emergence of a number of churches and religious groups which based their theories on end-time prophecies and theories. Some of these are the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormon Church, the Millerites, the Shakers, and others. All of these groups regarded biblical prophecies of the coming kingdom and the Promised Land essential to their beliefs. Furthermore, these groups in varying degrees regarded Islam and Muslims as occupiers of the Holy Land and thus enemies of Christianity and an obstacle to the fulfillment of prophecies. In 1810, just to give you a few examples, Jedediah Morse preached a sermon on prophecy in Charleston, Massachusetts, in which he predicted the collapse of the papacy and the doctrine of Muhammad to be followed by the restoration of the Jews and the Promised Land. And about a century later, Samuel Zwimmer, in a lecture at Princeton, predicted that when the crescent wanes, the cross will prove dominant, and the disintegration of Islam is a divine preparation for the evangelization of the Muslim world. The first American biographer of the Prophet Muhammad, George Bush, explained that his grand object, and I quote, "My grand object of writing this biography was to exhibit the Arabian prophet as a signal instrument in the hands of providence, to put the whole system of his imposture into the great scheme of divine administration of the world." Bush saw and I quote, divine interposition and infinite wisdom in the rise and establishment of this arch delusion in the world. These factors in American religious life were accompanied by, or perhaps resulted in, a surge of missionary activities and campaigns, many of which centered in the Muslim world, the Holy Land in particular. One example, Henry Jessup, in his book, The Mohammedan Missionary Problem, and Jessup spent 53 years in Syria as a missionary. He was one of the people who established the Syrian Protestant College, came to be known as the AUB, the American University of Beirut. He said he saw a striking coincidence in the history of Islam and Christianity. He says, and I quote, at the beginning of the 7th century, there occurred two events of momentous importance. One was the rise of the Mohammedan religion, the other, the Christianization of the Saxon race in Britain. Jessup sees the hand of providence in this historical coincidence. They, he says, were providential and related in the most intimate manner, as bearing on the welfare of the race and the future development of Christ's kingdom in the world. Jessup sees two other historical coincidences which were providentially related. He says, in the year 1492, the year in which Columbus discovered America, and thus helped in the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxon race in the New World, Ferdinand overthrew the last Spanish Mohammedan army, and Muslims were driven out into Africa. This combination of factors, augmented by scores of end-time prophecies, brought about a clear emergence of the Christian Zionist principles and beliefs, emphasizing regaining the Holy Land from Muslims, the ingathering of Jews in the Promised Land, and the ultimate defeat of Islam in the Battle of Armageddon. And I can't help but remember that when I was reading one of the sites of the Christian Zionists called Gog and Magog, it predicted that before Armageddon, and in order to bring about the last days, Damascus, my hometown, will be a heap of rubbles. And I was wondering if my insurance policy on the apartment for which we worked many years will cover an act of God in the literal as well as the legal sense. But the modern phase and of the story of this Christian Zionism has been amply covered by my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd like to open the floor to questions now. Please, but let them be questions. If there's something you want to discuss with any of the four of us, you can talk to us afterwards. We're all very accessible by email, by telephone, and we'd be happy to talk to any of you. But let's try to get in as many questions as we can and keep them brief. Let's start over here, right in the front.
Thank you, sir. Two brief questions. One is to the panelists. After the overview of the potentially dangerous phenomena of Christian Zionism in the United States, do you suggest any recommendations? Are you dealing with the U.S. government to provide any recommendations? Coupled with that, the question of fundamentalism per se and extremism is generally tolerated in the United States. The Rabbi can do it, but it is tolerated, except when it comes to the Muslims and non-Christian and non-Jewish faiths. So I wonder if the panelists can elaborate on that. And the second question is really more direct to Mr. Girardi. And I promise you I won't entice you to reveal any classified information. You spoke about the very beginnings of the Christian Zionist movement in the 80s. About the same time, President Reagan was in the White House. And I wonder if there was any official acquiescence between the semi-ending of the Cold War, using religion as a changing force, changing force, or was it indigenous within the United States? And the fact that you also mentioned there was aid, and I don't believe you used the term, but I'm paraphrasing, that the U.S. aid was transferred, U.S. aid to Israel was transferred to the Christian Zionists to realize their goals. Now, wouldn't that be a prohibition under U.S. law to transfer aid?
Well, that's three questions. Well, all right. The first question, let's go with the last one first. The issue of Christian Zionists receiving gifts from Israeli leaders when Israel receives a considerable amount of foreign aid from the United States and also receives charitable contributions virtually at an unlimited level, which are not challenged either by the Treasury Department or anyone else. So the question becomes, if that money is then used to influence the American political process, is it illegal? Well, it's illegal depending on how they do it. I would say giving an airplane to an evangelical leader is probably legal. But the fact is, if they're giving political contributions to a particular candidate like a Mitt Romney, that would be illegal. So I don't think that it depends on how it's done. So which other question would you like to go first?
The development of the Christian Zionist movement.
Oh, with the Reagan administration. Clearly, Reagan was the one who saw an underserved constituency for the Republican Party in the Christian Zionists. I believe I'm correct in saying that there are probably some in the room who know better than I, that Reagan actually established in the White House liaison with evangelicals. I believe that was a first under Reagan. And so I think this was a purely political move. And obviously it did good things for the Republican Party for a certain number of years in terms of getting them elected, but it's now turning around to bite them, because obviously this is it's become a legacy which brings with it a lot of things that the Republican Party maybe wishes it didn't have. So I think that would be the fairest answer to that. Norton, would you have another view on that?
Well, there may have been connections a little earlier. It may have been in the late 70s when in Israel the connection was first really made with Menachem Begin being the prime minister and the evangelicals, and that's when Jerry Falwell started to get gifts and so on. Then that seemed to then be reflected some in the White House, certainly in certain specific ways. So I would say that's probably a background to what happened a little later in the Reagan administration. But do you want to go to his question about the first question?
Yeah, recommendations to the...
Yeah, that's what I was going to address, what can be done about it. Very much events like this, publicizing it. I wrote an article you'll find on the internet, The Strangest Alliance in History, which is the evangelicals with the Likud and the settlers on the West Bank. It really is the strangest. Each side thinks it's going to gain from the other. Publicizing this, particularly publicizing the irrationality of it. It's not reported. Big media does not report these issues. I mentioned earlier, inside Israel, this growth of fundamentalist, the Harabim, which is close to the Muslim extremists, and also in their violence and their anti-democratic movement. This is public. That's not shown because the powers that be, if you will, the Israeli lobby, which is really today heavily, it's not even most Jews, I would say it's heavily dependent on the evangelical Christians and the military-industrial complex. That's what that lobby is today. But publicizing this, publicizing the irrationality of it, and doing the kind of things where it's hard to get through, but especially the illogic of this kind of an alliance.
John, can I just say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
I'd just like to fortify that and say one additional little thing as well. That actually for the last 3 years, if not 4, I've been going around and talking about Christian Zionism around the country, a few other countries as well, but around the country. And what I've found is that even though there may be 30, 40 million evangelical Christian Zionists, there are very, very large numbers of people, including large numbers of Christians, who really don't know what the theology is, and they don't know what some of the actual practical effects are. And when they hear it, many of them are astounded and also upset. So I just want to underline, in a sense, what John Utley just said, and then I just want to add one other thing quickly. This is not just true, we all know this, that what I'm going to say is not just true with evangelical Christian Zionists, it's true with lots of people. The younger generation is, if not always, often more prone to be open to certain questions about positions, even positions in their community, than older generations. Now, when I've gone around to a number, I try to go to as many as I can because it's part of the research. When I go around to Christian Zionist groups and I go into discussions, I'm not asked to be one of the speakers, I can tell you that. Once in a while I'm called upon to make a comment, but afterwards there usually has been some significant groupings of young people who will come and talk with me. They're not so interested in me per se, but they're interested in the substance of what this is. So in ways that might be done creatively, and you can just go to meetings to try to target the younger generations, even of evangelical Christian Zionists, that might work.
Okay, thank you, Norton. Okay, I'm going to take this question on the left, and we'll go over to the right, and then we'll come back.
Yes, my name is Kami Bhatt. I'm right from the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is that how to bring reasonable voices on the surface, especially in the attention of media, from both sides. It's look like what you have just said about Islamic theory or Islamic philosophy, most of them happen to be true. I was raised up as a Muslim, Deoband Muslim. And they do believe, I mean in Pakistan, I'm from that country, they brainwash you as a child against Jews and against Hindus. And when you are raised up, you think that these people are responsible for every problem in Muslim world. So, and not only in third world, but even in the United States, John, you see Suhail Khan, people like this. These people are basically fundamentalist Muslim. And it doesn't matter what they disguise in this country, that's how they organize their organization in this country. And I know Tom DeLay, yes, he used to believe that, but there are so many Muslims who don't believe these kind of things, that they just changed the name. From Jesus, they say it was the Mahdi, who would come, and then the Muslims who are true believers, they would take over almost everything of universe. So unless you have some reasonable voices against these people who have become very dominant, even in the United States, I'm talking about fundamentalist Muslims. They are really in there, and I have experience with them. I used to work on the Hill. I'm one of those who started Muslim prayer on the Hill. And these people are in their deep down, they are very fundamentalist Muslim. So I used to make a lot of noise against Jews or against Christian, fundamental Christian, but once I learned about these people, I backed off. There is no point, because I don't see any difference between these Zionist Christian and these fundamentalist Muslim who are running the show in this country.
You want to answer that?
And I said that the point is the media in America, and we're speaking to Americans, well publicized the Muslim fanatic or extremist. It's not shown the other side. And I said in my speech, they feed off each other. There is, let me say, there is a brighter side. The newer, most popular evangelicals in America, I think of Rick Warren, Joel Osteen. They don't preach like Falwell and Pat Robertson, the old men. I'm an old man, but it's really younger people change. And there's some good side, even in the American, in the Dallas Theological Seminary, I believe, Gary North, he's a Christian Institute for Christian Economics. He's the one who first put me on to the American evangelical Armageddon wanters. he writes that there's changes afoot among American evangelical. Dallas Theological Seminary now, of course, is that Armageddon will be postponed. So there are elements coming up.